a shocking discovery was made of a woman's body in a drainage culvert. On April 19, 1982, in Odessa, Texas, this brutal crime involving assault and slaying remained unsolved for nearly 4 decades. The investigators faced many challenges in their pursuit of justice. But then, a stunning breakthrough finally uncovered the identity of her perpetrator. Velma Nesset was born on December 11, 1916, to Iri Cassandra Mackey and Nettie Sultania Mackey. Later in life, Velma made the decision to relocate from her childhood home and moved to Odessa, Texas. As she approached her 60s, she continued to lead a quiet and unassuming life. However, it all changed on April 19th of 1982, when Velma was 65 years old. Velma was a reliable and dedicated employee at Permian Mall. She had a routine of walking to and from work, a habit she had followed for years without issue. That day, however, Velma failed to arrive at work, raising immediate concern among her coworkers. When her absence stretched beyond what was typical, both her family and friends grew worried and began to search for her. As the hours passed with no sign of Velma, her loved ones filed a missing persons report with the Odessa Police Department. A search was launched, and what they discovered was devastating. Velma was found in a drainage culvert, partially naked, having been assaulted and brutally slain. In the aftermath, the Odessa Police Department quickly made an arrest, and the suspect confessed to the heinous crime. It seemed justice would be swift, and Velma's family hoped for closure. However, during the trial in 1983, the case took a shocking turn. The suspect, despite their confession, was acquitted due to a lack of sufficient evidence and what was later determined to be a false confession. Following the acquittal, both the Texas Rangers and the Odessa Police Department continued their investigation into Velma's case. Despite their efforts, the case eventually went cold. Leads dried up, and no further arrests were made, leaving her loved ones without answers. Velma's case remained unsolved, with the authorities still working to bring justice for her tragic demise. In 2020, Velma Nesset's cold case received renewed attention when it became part of Texas DPS's Assault Kit Initiative, SAKI. This initiative, aimed at addressing unsolved crimes, provided crucial funding for advanced DNA testing and genealogy research. With the advancements in forensic science, investigators hoped to uncover new leads in the decades-old case and finally bring Velma's perpetrator to justice. The results of the testing were groundbreaking. Through extensive genealogical research, investigators identified a potential suspect, 62-year-old Billy Wayne Ludwigson. The findings were a significant breakthrough, linking Ludwigson to the crime that had gone unsolved for nearly 4 decades. After this initial identification, the investigators moved forward with normal forensic DNA testing to confirm the results. The DNA testing confirmed what investigators had suspected. Ludwigson was responsible for taking the life of Velma Nesset. At the time of the crime, Ludwigson had been just 20 years old, a young man whose involvement in the brutal assault and slaying had remained hidden for years. The discovery of his identity provided long-awaited answers to questions that had haunted Velma's family and the Odessa community for nearly 40 years. For the investigators, the identification of Ludwigson was a monumental step forward in the case. After decades of frustration and ends, they finally had a suspect whose DNA conclusively tied him to the crime scene. This crucial piece of evidence brought new hope to those who had tirelessly pursued justice for Velma. On July 30th, 2020, after years of uncertainty, a Texas Ranger and an Odessa Police Department detective traveled to Denver, Colorado, where they arrested Ludwigson. During the course of their investigation, they obtained Ludwigson's confession, further solidifying his connection to the crime. The arrest marked a pivotal moment in the case, finally bringing Velma's suspected perpetrator into custody after nearly 40 years. Following his arrest, Ludwigson was extradited to Texas, where he would face justice for his crime. On August 18, 2020, an Ector County grand jury officially indicted Ludwigson for ending the life of Velma. Ludwigson chose to plead guilty, further acknowledging his role in the brutal crime. His guilty plea spared the family from the ordeal of a drawn-out trial, providing a sense of closure that had eluded them for decades. While the years could never be undone, the plea allowed the legal process to move forward without further delay. On August 9, 2024, Ludwigson was sentenced by an Ector County jury to 20 years in prison. Although the sentence came more than 4 decades after the crime, it finally provided a measure of justice for Velma and her family. In October 2001, Christine Franke, a bright and adventurous 23-year-old University of Central Florida student, was brutally slain in her Orlando apartment. Despite crucial DNA evidence found at the scene, the investigation into her case went cold, leaving her family in a state of grief and uncertainty for nearly 2 decades. But a groundbreaking use of genetic genealogy technology brought the case back to life. After 17 long years, the police made an arrest, uncovering a suspect who had eluded capture for so long. Christine Franke was born into a lively Italian family on Long Island, New York, where her early years were filled with warmth, laughter, and the traditions of her heritage. Her parents, John and Tina Franke, emphasized the importance of family values, love, and togetherness. They created a nurturing environment where Christine and her siblings, brother John and sisters Barbara and Maria, could thrive. When Christine was 9, the family relocated to Vero Beach, Florida, seeking new opportunities and a change of scenery. The move was a significant moment for Christine, who quickly adapted to her new surroundings. The sunny coastal environment of Florida allowed her to explore the outdoors, fostering her adventurous spirit. Sister-in-law Karen Franke would later recall, "She was a free spirit, and she was never afraid to try anything. She would be the first to go out there surfing or riding a dirt bike or whatever the case. She just loved life." Her dedication to learning carried into her high school years at Vero Beach High School, where she developed a strong academic record and formed lasting friendships. Her passion for helping others, especially children, blossomed as she grew older, leading her to pursue a degree in elementary education at the University of Central Florida. Christine envisioned a career where she could inspire young minds and make a meaningful impact on their lives. As Christine approached graduation, she felt optimistic and excited about her future. She was determined to become a teacher and was eagerly looking forward to making a difference in her community. But just as Christine was on the brink of realizing her dreams, her life would be senselessly cut short. On a typical night on October 21st, 2001, in Orlando's Audubon Park, Christine finished her double shift at Cigars, a restaurant located at Universal Studio Orlando's City Walk, where she was working to support her studies. It was early in the morning, around 4 a.m., when she returned to her apartment. It is presumed she had several $100s in cash on her person from her shift, a detail that would later fuel suspicions of a robbery. Around 4:30 a.m., a neighbor in the apartment complex reported hearing a loud noise, described as like glass being broken, echoing through the otherwise peaceful night. This fleeting moment of disturbance went unnoticed by most, but it was a crucial detail that would later provide a timeline for investigators. Inside Christine's apartment, a gruesome scene would be waiting. A friend who had come to check on her after she failed to answer messages discovered Christine lying motionless on the floor, surrounded by a pool of blood. The sight was shocking, and she had suffered a single gunshot wound to the head. The friend immediately called 911, desperately attempting to assist her, but it was clear that Christine had already succumbed to her injuries. When the police arrived on the scene, they found the apartment in disarray, indicative of a violent struggle. Family members rushed to Christine's apartment, but the officers would not let them through the door. Even when the friend who found Christine confirmed the worst, they could not wrap their head around it. Investigators quickly identified the critical evidence. A .25 caliber shell casing was found near Christine's body, suggesting a targeted attack. Forensic teams meticulously combed through the apartment for evidence, collecting fingerprints, the shell casing, and any potential DNA samples. The officers interviewed neighbors, focusing on the one who reported the loud noise. Unfortunately, most residents had either not heard anything or were too asleep to provide substantial information. As investigators delved deeper into the case, they speculated that Christine's slaying may have started as a robbery. The timing of her return home, coupled with the cash she likely had on her, made it plausible that an intruder had targeted her apartment. But this theory led to few immediate leads. The fingerprints collected from the scene were processed, but led to ends. None matched known individuals in police databases, leaving investigators frustrated and with limited leads. The analysis of the bullet confirmed it had been fired from a .25 caliber handgun, a weapon that could be easily concealed, but the type of gun provided little assistance in narrowing down a suspect. The DNA evidence found at the scene was considered the most promising lead. Investigators hoped that a match could be found in either local or national databases, so they sent samples for analysis. Despite thorough efforts, the investigation stalled. Over the next several months, detectives pursued every lead. They interviewed dozens of Christine's friends, family, co-workers, and neighbors, collecting DNA samples in hopes of finding a match. None of the tests returned positive, and the case went cold. Throughout the years, the authorities conducted routine checks against national law enforcement DNA databases, but for over a decade, no matches would ever be found. The police reached out to the community, urging anyone with information to come forward, but public interest waned over time and leads dried up. Christine's mother said, "I was still in denial that it could be her, but it was. It was a hard time." Christine's case remained cold for 15 years, cycling through the hands of different investigators as leads dried up and frustration mounted. The first detective on the case was transferred, and subsequent detectives retired, leaving the investigation with little progress. By the time Detective Michael Fields inherited the case in 2012, it seemed destined to remain unsolved, but a breakthrough in another high-profile case changed everything. In April 2018, the California authorities announced that they had identified the infamous Golden State Slayer using an innovative genetic genealogy technique. By entering DNA from crime scenes into a public database, GED Match, which holds genetic profiles from users of services like 23andMe and Ancestry.com, they found distant relatives of the perpetrator. This breakthrough inspired Detective Fields to take a similar approach with Christine Franke's case. Fields contacted Parabon Nanolabs, a Virginia-based company specializing in DNA analysis and genealogy. Parabon had recently begun assisting law enforcement by using genealogy websites to help identify unknown suspects through their relatives. The lab's lead genealogist, Cece Moore, and her team set to work. They entered the DNA evidence collected from Christine's crime scene into GED Match. Soon they found two cousins of the suspected perpetrator, tracing their common ancestors to a couple who had lived in Valdosta, Georgia. But the task was far from simple. Detective Fields said, "This was not a family tree, this was a family forest." The Valdosta couple had an enormous family, which meant investigators and the team at Parabon had to meticulously trace the branches of the family tree. They gathered additional DNA samples from relatives, eliminating suspects based on age, sex, and other factors. After sifting through over 100 family members, they narrowed the list of possible suspects down to two brothers, both of whom lived in Orlando, just a few miles from the police headquarters. Detective Fields and his team began surveillance on the two brothers, drafting warrants to collect DNA from both. An undercover officer collected a saliva sample from one brother via a discarded sports drink bottle, but when the DNA was tested, it did not match the sample from the crime scene. That left only one suspect, Benjamin Lee Holmes Jr. Holmes, who lived in Orlando's Rosemont North neighborhood, became the focus of intense surveillance. Officers watched him carefully, waiting for a chance to collect DNA. Eventually, they saw him smoke a small cigar and discard it along with an empty beer can. These items were quickly retrieved and sent for testing. The result was definitive. Holmes's DNA was a direct match to the sample found at the crime scene of Christine. Holmes was a manager at a Wendy's restaurant in Orlando and had a criminal record mostly related to low-level illegal substance charges, probation violations, and domestic violence. He was living in the same area of Orlando as Christine at the time of the crime, and while no true motive was ever explicitly determined, detectives believe it was a robbery and a crime of opportunity. Holmes was arrested in November 2018 and charged with the slaying of Christine Franke, though he denied any involvement, claiming he did not know how his DNA ended up at the scene. His arrest closed a cold case that had haunted the Franke family for years. Benjamin Holmes Jr.'s parents, Benjamin Holmes Sr. and his wife, had been approached by detectives seeking DNA to close the case. While Mrs. Holmes agreed to provide a sample, her husband refused without a court order. Mrs. Holmes later expressed regret for participating, stating that had she known the true reason for the detectives' visit, which was that they were investigating a potential violent crime in her family, she might not have agreed to provide her DNA. Christine's case brought a bittersweet sense of closure to her family after nearly 2 decades of uncertainty and heartache. For years, they lived with the pain of her sudden loss, haunted by unanswered questions and the absence of justice. Christine's mother, Tina Franke in particular, had been relentless in her pursuit of answers, refusing to let her daughter's memory fade into an unsolved crime. For Tina, the news came with relief and disbelief. She said, "To be honest, I thought he was deceased. He had not surfaced for 17 years. This is such a blessing for our family. We are so overwhelmingly grateful for what the investigators have done for us," Karen Franke said. "We are a big Italian family, so we do everything together. It has been, really hard not having her part of the family the last 17 years. She added that Christine's demise was especially hard on her father, John Franke. It just really kind of broke him. He was never the same. He passed away in November 2015, 3 years before the man police suspected of taking the life of his daughter was finally caught. Though Holmes never explained his motive, nor admitted to the crime, the conviction gave Christine's family some measure of peace in knowing that the person responsible had been held accountable. Still, the loss of Christine remains a void in their lives. She was a bright and kind young woman full of potential, and her family continues to honor her memory in the hopes that her story will remind others of the importance of persistence in the face of injustice. On March 23, 2023, Holmes was sentenced to life in prison without parole. During the sentencing, he said, "I am not the man or the person who took the life of Christine Franke. It hurts. Unfortunately, I am the man who was found guilty." Christine's mother was surprised Holmes spoke out. She and her family were there for the sentencing and said that they were glad justice was served. She said, "We have waited 22 years for this. If someone's accused wrong, I would never want that to happen, but the evidence all just points to him. That DNA does not lie." On a cold, rainy night in February 1990, Pamela Faye Felkins was closing up the Crossroads video store in Greenbrier, Arkansas. As she prepared to leave for the night, a stranger entered, setting off a chain of events that would lead to her abduction and brutal slaying. For decades, her case remained a haunting mystery, but with new advancements in DNA technology, there was finally reignited hope for justice in a case that had long gone cold. Pamela Faye Felkins was known as a devoted wife, loving mother, and cherished member of the Greenbrier community. At 32 years old, she lived a quiet life in rural Arkansas, where she balanced the responsibilities of work and family. Pamela was employed at the local Crossroads video store, where her friendly nature made her well-liked by customers who regularly stopped in to rent movies. February 2nd, 1990, was a cold, rainy evening in the quiet town of Greenbrier, Arkansas. Pamela was finishing her shift. She was scheduled to close the store at 9 p.m. and planned to be picked up by her husband once her shift was over. Around 8:40 p.m., as she prepared to close up for the night, a young couple was leaving the store when a tall, heavy-set man entered. This man, in his 30s or 40s, with a tattoo on his left arm, would become the primary suspect in the horrific events that would soon unfold. With her husband running late, Pamela allowed the man to enter and browse the shelves. while she sat behind the counter sipping coffee and smoking a cigarette. It was a seemingly uneventful close to the day, but as the clock ticked closer to her shift's end, Pamela would unknowingly come face to face with the man that would end her life. Shortly after the man entered the store, Pamela was abducted. Reports suggest that she was likely taken against her will and transported to a secluded location where she suffered unimaginable violence. Later that night, when her husband arrived to pick her up, he found the store empty, the lights still on, and Pamela nowhere in sight. The unsettling discovery triggered immediate concern, and authorities were quickly alerted. A search ensued throughout the town, but it was not until the following day, February 3rd, that the horrific truth came to light. Pamela's lifeless body was discovered in a remote area off Clinton Mountain Road, miles from the video store. The authorities quickly noted several gruesome details. Pamela had multiple cuts on her legs and had been brutally beaten about the head and shoulders with a blunt object, the fatal injury being a severe blow to her head. She had also been assaulted, and a sample was obtained from the male DNA found at the scene. The investigation into Pamela's slaying began immediately, but the evidence was sparse. A witness at a diner at the nearby Wagon Wheel restaurant reported seeing a light blue Chevrolet truck with a white panel and camper shell parked near the video store around the time of the abduction. But despite extensive searches, the vehicle never surfaced, leaving investigators grasping at straws. One of the earliest investigators on the case was Faulkner County Sheriff's investigator Marty Montgomery, who had known Pamela personally. He and other officials quickly developed a theory that the assault may have occurred in an abandoned mobile home on Heath Lane, based on several intelligence reports. The only named person of interest in the initial years was John Mosley, a convicted offender living near the site, but DNA tests later cleared him. The investigation went along for years, plagued by false tips and rumors that led to ends. Without any substantial evidence, the case stalled. As technology advanced, investigators revisited Pamela's case in 2018, leading to a major breakthrough. Using DNA genealogy, they identified a match to Edward Keith Renegar, who had lived in Greenbrier at the time of the slaying. He had been a customer at the video store many times, but Pamela did not know him, and neither did her friends or family. Renegar had a surgical scar on his left forearm. This may or may not have been what the couple saw on the man who was entering the video store as they were leaving it, thinking it was a tattoo. Renegar, a former truck driver, had a history of assault of women and served 10 months in prison for the 1994 kidnapping at knife point of a Cleburne County woman who managed to escape. After serving time, he moved to Utah, where he lived with his father before passing away of cancer in 2002. Sheriff Tim Riles announced the findings at a press conference, noting that Renegar's DNA matched that found at the crime scene with a 99.9% accuracy. They also confirmed a match through DNA from Renegar's biological daughter. His daughter told authorities that Renegar had been abusive toward his 2 ex-wives. One had a restraining order against him. The recent developments in Pamela Felkins' cold case have reignited hope for her family and the community that has long awaited justice. Wilma Putt, Pamela's sister, acknowledged the progress made, stating that the announcement was good, but that a lot of unanswered questions still remain. Investigator Marty Montgomery, who has been personally invested in the case since it happened, reflected on the emotional burden it has carried. He recalled, "Pam and I grew up together. The fact that we have not been able to identify a perpetrator has haunted me. As authorities continue to piece together the evidence and seek more information about the primary suspect, Edward Renegar, the community remains united in their quest for closure and truth."